Well, thanks to all of you for coming. We have a really interesting panel, so I want to plunge in quickly. Let me just say one very quick sort of prefatory word. Clearly, democracy is based on the supposition that people make decisions about those issues that affect their lives through their representatives. And the second supposition that goes along with that is that we, the people, have the intelligence to do that. The news media, of course, is one of the main vectors by which we, the people, become informed to make these decisions. And yet I think it's also undeniably true that there has been a real defoliation of the media in terms of its ability to discuss complex, serious, sometimes very interesting, and sometimes less interesting because of their complexity issues. And that's really what we're here to address today. Who's reading, who's watching, who cares? This field logically breaks up into two different areas. One, of course, is domestic, and the other is international. As you all know, there's been a real diminution of international coverage, which is very counterintuitive given the fact that the world is also in the throes of globalization, which makes each of us and each of our countries more dependent on what goes on in other countries. Locally, of course, I think it's also undeniable. We just went through a political campaign where never in my lifetime have I seen such aversion to any subject of consequence to anyone. In fact, you could count on one amputated hand the number of serious issues that received any serious and thorough discussion. Now, joining us today to try to look at how the media has changed, if in fact it has, and how well it is doing in covering this kind of discussion, and why we aren't doing better, and why is it that you're here, but the supposition is that you don't want to hear this sort of stuff. Again, it's rather odd. To unravel this mystery, we have four panelists. Richard Threlkeld, to my left, was the CBS Moscow bureau chief until 1999, and for many years was a foreign correspondent for CBS in Vietnam, covered the Gulf War, Panama, Grenada, was in Beijing in 1989, and has written the book Dispatches from the Former Evil Empire. Mark Cooper, to my immediate left, has just written the book Pinochet and Me, Chilean Anti-Memoir. He's appeared in many magazines, Harper's, Rolling Stone, others. He is a contributing editor to The Nation and also is the host of the program Radio Nation, which is syndicated around the country. That applause has a suspicious air to it. On my right is Richard Reeves, who's a syndicated columnist of long-standing, author of the book President Kennedy, more recently What People Know, Freedom and the Press, and also teaches now at USC. Judy Muller, sitting next to me on the right, is a longtime ABC television correspondent for the evening news as well as Nightline, and she is author of this book here, Now This, Radio, TV, and the Real World. So let's start maybe with you, Richard, and we'll just move down the line.
Thank you, Orville. Let me tell you a story. A couple of years ago, my wife, Betsy Aaron, the CNN correspondent, and I took a vacation to Laos in Southeast Asia. We'd never been there before, and one hot day in the middle of the Plain of Jars, we stopped for lunch at a bend in the road, really, not even a village, and there was a small hut with a little bitty kitchen and some sticky rice, and a few villagers, naked children, beetle nut-chewing women, gap-toothed men sitting on their haunches. We were 50 miles from the nearest electric light and 100 miles from the nearest telephone, but there was a gasoline-powered engine which was hooked up to a black and white TV set, and it was noon, and the TV set was tuned to the one Laotian channel from Vientiane, which had the government news on at noon, and the lead story was Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky with pictures. And the villagers looked at that news report, and then they looked at us, and then they looked back at the news report, and then they looked at us, and then they began to laugh. Hee, hee, hee. The point of which is what? Laotians, even in that little village, and most of the people in the rest of the world know intimately, much more, and care intimately about us than the reverse. And why is that? Well, we've always been an insular nation, I think, but I would submit for purposes of this panel that in the last 15 years, network television the commercial networks have done much to foster this and not much to help. Mostly, and this is not a bulletin, foreign news coverage has dipped dramatically in story count, in numbers of bureaus. There's a merger going on where they stick correspondents in London, the 3-4 networks do, and use the same material in different voiceovers as if the person really is in Zimbabwe when he's not. They do this because the consultants have told them that it's no longer important to give people the news that we used to in journalism school argue about the news people we thought needed to know, but the news they manifestly want to know, according to the consultants, who may be right. So most of the network newscasts these days are loaded with what I call health and beauty tips instead of foreign news or any other kind of news other than a few headlines at the front and a lot of feature stories. They really have become more People magazine, I think, than news. Maybe the consultants are right, but I must say at the same time that this has been going on over the last 7 years. The number of people in this country who say they watch at least one network newscast a day has dropped from 60% to 30%. So I think it's time that they may think about firing those consultants. I view this obviously, as I think you do, as a very serious trend, because obviously if we don't know and don't get the information, and as we all know, most people get their information from television rather than newspapers, which is another problem. If we don't know what's going on in the rest of the world, and as my wife says, when you watch a television newscast at night, don't worry about what they are telling you, worry about what they're not telling you. Worry about what you're not seeing, and what you're not seeing is foreign news and the news that you and I and the rest of this country needs to know to be intelligent voters and to have a viable democracy.
Mark.
I guess I also want to tell a story, but I want to preface it by saying that I don't think that there were any good old days when we talk about the media. I remember being on media panels like this 20 years ago, literally, when we talked about how good things were 20 years before. So I don't think there are any good old days, but I do think that because things are getting so much worse, that the bad old days look good in comparison. And in that context, I'm thinking about this panel. I remember something in my own life as a journalist about 20 years ago, around 1981 or 1982, something like that. I was the news director for the very disreputable listener-sponsored station here in town, KPFK. And I was taking a leave at the time, and I was going to go do some reporting on Chile. And I called, as I was reminded by Judy, I was trying to remember his name, I called this kind of legendary guy who was running CBS radio at the time, Larry McCoy, one of these curmudgeonly, you know, the whole scene. And I said to Larry, I'm going to Chile and I'd really like to do some stringing for CBS while I'm there. And he said, send in your resume and some tapes and some references, et cetera. And I did. And I called him back the next week and I said, well, what do you think? And he says, you know, you're really good. I really like your stuff and you look great for this. He says, I only have one concern, and that is this network you work for, Pacifica, seems a little odd. They have some strange programs on it. And you know, I kind of rolled with the punches, and it worked out. And I was thinking what that conversation would be like today for a young person talking to CBS or ABC or NBC, and I think it would be the opposite. I think the young person would say, you know, I was really interested in doing some stringing for you while I'm in Latin America, but then again, you are the guys who do Survivor and Temptation Island and Big Brother and Howard Stern and Leonardo DiCaprio as your special correspondent. Would you really be interested in this? What that anecdote leads me to believe is that, with all due respect to our own panel, I think these sort of discussions are really behind the curve. I think this is like sitting around talking about tobacco in 1968 and wondering if it causes cancer or not. And we sit around and wring our hands and say, well, you know, the line between health and cancer is being blurred a little bit with tobacco. And all these lines that we talk about, I remember talking about the lines being blurred 20 years ago. And then I remember the lines being blurred 15 years ago and 10 years ago. And it's not a black and white picture, but the lines aren't blurred. The lines have been erased. And I'm concerned because I don't really see the world of media criticism and of journalism, of criticism and journalism moving very far ahead. It's far outpaced by the changes in journalism and media itself. I guess, just to only take another minute or so, I guess there's two things that come to mind. One is I've unfortunately spent a certain amount of time around journalism schools in the last 10 years, and I've seen what goes on and I see what comes out, and there are some very good journalism schools. But, Orville, but
Thank you, Mark.
I would say that never have so many people been so prepared to say so little. That is to say, the standards, the technical standards, and the methodological standards are much greater than ever before, and yet too many of the J schools turn out people, they pump out compliant cogs the way that some of my friends here have written. It's like trade schools feeding a never-ending assembly line. So my very brief conclusion is that the one area that we ought to be talking about, I really propose that we advance the discussion now. We just agree that something's wrong, and we start thinking about some ways to get past this. And I know it's a really, really unpopular idea, but I think that unless we really start talking about ownership of the media, we're going to be having these discussions for the next 40 years and remembering the good old days here. And there are no easy answers because we tend to think of only two things. We either think of the model that we have now, which are really private corporate monopolies, in which, to quote somebody else from Berkeley, Ben Bagdikian, it turns the news into an industrial byproduct. Either we have that model, people think, or we have a kind of Soviet state-run model. In fact, those aren't the only models. There are other models available. We just don't think about them, and the media certainly doesn't talk about them. But we have to think about serious, democratic, public ownership of media, or we're going to be in this cycle for the next 50 years.
Thanks, Mark. Judy.
Larry McCoy is no longer there.
Of course.
I worked at CBS Radio for that news director, and he was tough, and I learned a lot from him, but he became more and more discouraged as what happened at CBS Radio was happening at commercial radio stations all over the country, less and less time for news. They brought in newscasters, anchors who sounded like disc jockeys. They all sounded the same. When I first came there, I was sitting between Douglas Edwards and Richard C. Hottelet. It was something, and now all of these guys sound like they're announcing the top 10 hits. But that's radio. And I still do NPR, and it's you're right, public radio, public television, they're doing a wonderful job, and I think serve as wonderful models. A friend of mine at CBS, a former producer at CBS News, said if Harvest of Shame were done today, it would be a consumer reporter for a magazine show standing in a field with the migrant workers saying, do you know who's picking your beans? Are they clean? Because the migrant workers aren't in the demographic that we're targeting. Ratings, you're right, it's old news, but just to repeat it, ratings drives what we report. There are focus groups that are, we ask their opinion about what they liked from last night. I gather, I've never actually talked to them myself, but this is what's happening now. We don't report stories that might enlighten always. We try to. I mean, there's a real battle going on in the newsrooms in this country, especially evening news, which might seem to be the most threatened because nobody comes home at 6 o'clock every night and says, oh, let's watch the news. They can watch CNN all day. They can get it on the Internet. We've been losing audience to all of these other sources, and maybe for other reasons. So everybody's trying to reinvent what we are, and in the process, become kind of, a creature with an elephant's trunk and a zebra's tail, and we're not quite sure what we want to be yet. So you get a lot of features, and I'm trying to remember one that aired. I tuned in one night, and it was, "Is there sex over 50? Coming up." You know, who's asking this question? I want to know.
Actually, a lot of people.
Yeah, to be fair, we try to carve out sections of the newscast that address some in-depth. I think one of the newscast calls, might be NBC, it calls it in-depth. We call ours a closer look. We used to have something like that was called, I don't know what it was called, American something or other, and it was 4 minutes long, and it was quite wonderful, because if you got to do 4 minutes in a 25-minute newscast, that was a hefty amount of time. That didn't exist. The way it was set up was a problem and a possible solution within 4 minutes. We got rid of the problem. Then it was just called, because apparently the focus group said, we just want solutions, happiness. So we were told to go out and do 2 minutes on solutions. So it was called Solutions, and then that gave way to something called a closer look, which is, if possible, less than 2 minutes. And I worry that it will soon be a cursory look, and we just will admit. If a story then has a ratings potential and it shows to do well in the ratings, I mean, this is, I really despair at this. I laugh about it, but it saddens me too. A story, for instance, like JFK Jr.'s death. Yes, a couple of days. It was a shock. A couple of days. But I went away for a week to a place where there's no television, came back, and it was still going on. And I actually tuned in to hear a network correspondent ask of the Reverend Billy Graham, just answer this one question for us. How could God have done this to us? I mean, and what do they expect? God to say, pilot error, But we drag these things out. We go to, our school shootings. I mean, I was there at Columbine. It's a very difficult story to do. It's very traumatic for reporters to cover those stories. And we stay way too long. The town really resents us. I don't blame them. Because somebody in New York is saying, that story, is still of interest. Well, the story is still pulling in numbers. It's sad, and I worry about that a lot. I also worry about the encroachment of entertainment, obviously, into news, celebrity reporting about celebrities, reporters who are celebrities. I don't know if you've heard the story. There's a woman, and I've met her, very nice lady, was an actress for NYPD Blue, and quit acting. And I talked with her before she went. She was eager to become a reporter, change jobs. Admirable. She was going to go to Albuquerque and pay her dues, and but as I learned, she was really being trained to go to the network as soon as possible. A network. CNN just hired her less than a year in Albuquerque. A very pretty actress. I gather some of the movies she was in earlier, which were fairly racy, are now a problem, but CNN is going to, as they say, stand behind her, which I thought was. At any rate, those of us who actually did pay our dues in radio stations and newspapers and came up that way, it's a little hard to see. And yet, I'm sure people will tune in to listen to her. So I hate to sound pessimistic, But those are the things I observe on a daily basis, and they worry me. Ted Koppel likes to say that when all of this falls out and people have all of these ways of getting their information, the internet, tabloids, extra, hard copy, whatever you want, that in the end they're going to say, well, wait a minute, who can we really trust? Who do we really believe? Who has a record? And that in that case, quality journalism will count for something, that people will come back to it, tune into it, and understand the difference, which might require, I think, a media literacy kind of curriculum in the schools. And I really believe that strongly, that we should be teaching media literacy to elementary schools and high schools to let kids understand the difference between hard copy and Peter Jennings. I hope there's a, you know. But truly, you know, this is an area of education that's been neglected, and I think perhaps if we educate the public and do exactly what Mark was talking about, we might win after all. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. Dick?
Actually, to be fair to CNN, they intend to stand in front of the lady rather than behind. There are two things, I think, that, or a way to approach what it is those of us up here do for a living. That is, there are changes both in how we report, or how news is delivered, and in what news, as Richard said, is reported. And the changes of the technology of the media itself probably overwhelm and outweigh whatever it is we say and think. I mean, the fact of the matter is there was a time when information could not move faster than a railroad train or a sailing ship, and we built up governmental systems which allowed government, particularly presidents, to control the flow of information to the people, whether it was gold being discovered in Sacramento or Pearl Harbor, two stories which were delivered by authorities with very little relationship to what had actually happened, because they wanted to get the Army out on the Oregon Trail before people rushed to California. And in the case of Pearl Harbor, the President of the United States thought that if the American people knew how much of our naval capacity had been eliminated, they might not be willing to fight a war. So that what the people know and when they know it really is at the heart of the democracy, and that has changed. Today, because of these advances, leaders can no longer control the flow of information very well. We all get information at the same time generally now, usually by satellite technology. So that how news is gathered and delivered has changed, inevitably changed with those technology. What is being reported has also changed greatly and has great impact, I think. Domestic reporting, much of it is awesome if you do this for a living. It's conceivable to me that some of the domestic reporting and the talent of the people doing it really will be looked back as a golden age of journalism on domestic matters, where you have a populace and a press which are infinitely better educated and knowledgeable than they once were, partly because of the technology. But when I got to the New York Times in 1966, many of the people there, large numbers, really got there on an apprenticeship. You started as a copy boy. If you kept your nose clean, you moved up a little bit and ended up being a reporter on the New York Times. Some of those people were very good. Some of them were very limited. Today, as far as I can tell, the education and knowledgeability level of the people in the press much, much higher than when I was practicing it on a day-to-day basis. And even with the monopolies, the little papers out across the country, because of things like the New York Times News Service, Washington Post, LA Times News Services, plus the fact that people can see much of these events, make the smaller papers in the middle of the country, at least as far as I can tell, are infinitely better than what I remember from the 60s and beyond. In writing a book on John Kennedy and now another on Richard Nixon, which is about to come out, I spent years literally reading old newspapers, and they were not very good. And papers like the New York Times today are extraordinary. The reason the magazine business has so much trouble is because of the numbers of talented people putting out products like that every day. Our foreign coverage is essentially non-existent now, and it's feeding, it's a very dangerous time, I think, on that level, in feeding this kind of unilateralist mentality that's now developed in the United States, and obviously we know there are fools in China who don't understand that it's a privilege to be spied upon by us. We don't spy on penny ante countries. They made the cut, and they should be grateful and give us our plane back. And also mention that throughout the entire Cold War, there were million-dollar bounties and witness protection programs offered to any Chinese or Soviet pilots who would fly MiGs in so we could check them. And in fact, in the most famous of cases, in the middle 70s, when we wanted to see what the MiG-25 looked like and how it worked, a Soviet pilot flew one into Japan. He's probably living in New Mexico now selling real estate or something, but he got the million-dollar bounty and he got the new identity, whatnot, and we sent the plane back to the Soviets 9 weeks later. There was no question it was their property, and we sent it back in crates, since we had checked everything out. And I think that our journalism has become so naive internationally that these stories, it's impossible for modern journalism as it exists now to get these things into perspective. The gap also grows great. There are advantages. I mean, after all, you can get the BBC, Entente, Deutsche News on television now and get a picture. If you want to know who the Taliban are, for instance, these people actually go there and spend time with them. But we are reporting more. Far and away, no one here mentioned the largest news organization in the United States with 180 foreign bureaus, Bloomberg. Bloomberg is the biggest employer of journalists in the country because, as part of what we've all lived through, the triumph of economics over politics in our time is complete. It's a form of niche journalism, but people want those numbers, even from countries who have not seen an AP or a New York Times reporter or a network correspondent for 20 years. There are people working there full-time for Bloomberg, measuring how high the wheat is or whether the gold they found in some hill is the real or the mock. So that there is journalism is always a triage. If something is covered, something else is not. I'm coming full circle to Richard's point about that. One of the great examples of that was in if you look in the 1970s, there came a time when the environment became news. Earth Day began, I believe, in 1970, and more things are being reported. But if you go back and measure those papers at that time, which fate made me do, the fact is that we have time. The American press does one social problem at a time. The social problem before Earth Day was civil rights. There was race reporting, and some of it very, very good, coming from all over the country, particularly the South, but all over. As coverage of the environment grew, coverage of civil rights dropped exactly the same number of column issues to the problem, but now journalism defined the problem, or perhaps the burgeoning middle and upper middle classes decided the problem was the air we breathe, not the airs that we put on. Michael Gettler, who is the ombudsman for the Washington Post, has done some marvelous job, which the Post has not liked at all, talking about the triage of journalism. That if one story is in the paper, another isn't. And I think the Washington Post started as kind of a trade secret because they've complained about about that reporting. But again, I'll close by going to the same point. It is the problems in journalism today are not what's being reported. I mean, the kind of junk stuff that we see every day. There's always some version of that. But other than economic news, I would argue that nothing is being covered extensively today. We have great feature reporting on many domestic issues because we have great reporters and great newspapers and magazines. But beyond that, we are totally ignorant of the world and of much of what is going on in our own country.
Thanks, Dick. In a little while, we want to throw this open to questions from you all, but let's just get a little discussion going amongst the four panelists. Let me raise a question. I think one of the things that really has changed in the last 10 or 20 years is the fact that I find very few people of my generation who are, at very good positions in the media, who are truly happy, content, who feel dignified by what they do. Now, I think there used to be a time where there was at least a small group of people, relatively, there were places to aspire to be where one did indeed feel dignified, that one could do what one felt was needed to be a distinguished, credible journalist. Now, the question for you all is this. What is happening here? Is it that journalists themselves are in a fallen state of grace? Or is there some institutional context into which everybody is forced to fit, which really deprives them of the ability to have that sort of dignity of profession to carry out their responsibilities as they understand them?
Well, I'd like to answer that because I wanted to add, after my remarks, that make no mistake that the people I work with, the other reporters and reporters I know from other networks, many of my editors in New York, we really, really care about what we do, and we agonize about these very issues. But as long as the ratings and the money and the advertising drives the engine, you could stand up and say, I'm not going to do this, and you could lose your job. That would be, it's a terrible place to be in. So I think it is institutional. I think it is profit-driven, and I don't know the way out of that unless it's the way Mark was discussing.
Just to beat this theme to death, I've always been taken by the ability of we as journalists are very good at attacking, looking at any problem and understanding it systemically. So we look at campaign finance reform. We can explain the system, right? We look at the wheat crops. We can understand the entire commercial apparatus that produces this crop and the way it's produced and marketed. What astounds me, and I'm not talking about this panel, what astounds me is when you set journalists down to talk about journalism, all of a sudden they get real stupid. They start talking about, we try hard and we do this and we do that, but we blew this story and we blew that story. What happened to the systemic analysis? What happened to the ability to look at the system and say, it's actually this way because, to answer your question, I can't speak in first person, fortunately, but I can assume that when you put in 25 years at a place like ABC, you get a little rattled when your boss is somebody 20 years younger than you who comes from a company that worships a talking mouse. And where I'm going to agree with Richard and disagree with Richard is that if we look at the really good journalism that's out there, and I didn't mean to imply by any means that there isn't great journalism out there. There is. And one can argue whether there's more or less good journalism. The problem is that what good journalism exists in a completely different media context than 20 years ago. So what we have is a decrease in knowledge in proportion to the increase of information. So we talk about information, but the information's worthless. I mean, look what you said, Dick. We live in a world where we're told every 2.5 seconds that this is a new global world where it's global this, global that, and yet every one of us knows that we as people know much less about the world than we've ever known before in our history. How many people cannot know so much? So what I'm going to take some exception and say that I think your point is well taken in that we have to ask what's not being reported. But there's also a question of what is being reported as well. What's not being reported is a bigger issue. But we should not just accept what's being reported and say, well, that's okay too, because too much of that is about information with a capital I and not really enough about delivering knowledge and context and discussion and judgment and analysis. It is, I think what Dick said about Bloomberg is brilliant, because that is, to me, the highest expression of our problem. What better embodiment of the problem that we face, that the greatest journalistic organization in the world today is one that moves numbers back and forth about sales, essentially, because that's what Bloomberg does.
And as a consequence, we're learning more than we want to know, or at least some of us do, about the price of wheat in Sahel, and not about the extent of AIDS in South Africa. I think that's part of the problem. Also, I think those of us who are old enough do misremember our history in the television news. Yes, there was Harvest of Shame, but there was on CBS. But Bill Paley also had Milton Berle, and I anchored a morning news show that was followed by Captain Kangaroo for a while. So you know, the mouse has nothing on Bill Paley, who made money, but also knew how important news was. We also there were salad days, and yes, we had a much better ethos and elan in 1965, Orville, because we were inventing something. It was brand new. It was like inventing flight, Dick was talking about Walter Cronkite one day decided the environment was important in about 1973. And so we would do a piece every day on the environment, and it always had a logo on it. It was this enormous hand on top of the world, and of course the technicians quickly dubbed it the hand job. as in, oh, Walter's going to do another environmental piece, get the hand job. Get the hand job. And the point being, as Dick very well points out, we do set the agenda. I mean, we really do. If we decide, we decide how important are those 11 guys and gals in China. We decided civil rights is not important now because we're going to use the time to make the environment important. And when we don't make things like overseas news important and therefore makes all of us more ignorant in that regard, I think we do serious damage to ourselves.
But Richard, those 11 guys in China, I mean, as great as it was that they landed the plane and saved the lives, my father, who's a retired Navy captain and lives up near Whidbey, I called him the day they were coming home, and he said, well, the headlines are full of, heroes come home. And he says, and I got to tell you, 11 days on good Chinese food from where I come from, but all the networks were up there, all the anchors from the morning shows were up there to greet him. If I saw one more yellow ribbon, I mean, and based on the worst song possibly ever written. It really, but we just milk it and milk it and milk it, and there is no context. There is no context of what qualifies as heroism in the broad picture.
And maybe we don't need to know this country about foreign news. Maybe we can continue to survive as a basically insular society that won the Cold War. Hey, we've been doing great the last 10 years, and I would remind you that the Chinese, who believe that China's the middle kingdom, and they're sort of it, and nobody else matters, have gotten along pretty well off and on for the last 5,000 years. But I wouldn't want to bet on it.
There was a anecdote that I mentioned a couple of days ago. I was privileged enough to have on my radio show here in town Bill Kovich and Tom Rosenstiel, who are here now. And of course, they've taken on the ungodly task of trying to actually prick the conscience of journalists on this. So, but when I was talking to them, I said that day, this was, I think this was Wednesday, wasn't it? Just a couple of days ago, Thursday. Something happened on CNN that afternoon that really caught my attention. I'm going to ask the audience here, does anybody here know who Dr. Ron Szymanski is? Well, there we go, which is, there's no reason for anybody to know, and yet there's 5 or 6 people who know. And that afternoon, I was watching CNN's so-called a debate show, which is the Talk Back Live, at 12 noon, and they were actually talking about something interesting, which was Senator Kerry's remarks and the whole legacy of Vietnam and the legacy of World War II and the legacy of Hiroshima, and it was a good discussion as these things go. And I actually got into it, and about 10, 12 minutes before the hour was up, CNN interrupted itself with not a hand job, but something similar. Some breaking news music, and like the world's just come to an end, and we interrupt ourselves to bring you, and then they brought us a picture from Videophone which is some sort of digital. It was like watching The Man on the Moon in 1969, that kind of slow, jerky video, and we were live from Punta Arenas, Chile, where Dr. Ron Szymanski, who had been in the Antarctica and had a gallbladder problem, was now arrived safely, I can remember, on an Osprey 2 airplane. All this information that I really need, and that he was going to be operated on the next Saturday and have his gallbladder removed because his pancreas was in bad shape. And the part that was amazing to me was that CNN had sent a correspondent to Punta Arenas to do this. And Punta Arenas is literally at the tip of the world. It's the
fully dressed correspondent.
Oh, right. And they sent a correspondent there, and you ask yourself, I mean, I have to say, I'm just going to tell you, that kind of stuff fills me with hopelessness about this. I look at that and I say, you've got to be kidding me. I've got to know about Dr. Szymanski's gallbladder, but...
What worries me is that I was actually interested.
Take it.
I mean, this raises the proverbial question. You mentioned Richard, we. Now, who is this we, and how far up the food chain do you have to get in the great cadre of we before you get the people who are making the problem?
Well, I think...
I'm not sure it's the journalists.
No, it's not. It's obviously not. And Mark, I think, has us on the right track, which is we can sit here all day and tell great stories, and we can all laugh, and why not? But it doesn't solve anything. And I'm not really very optimistic that it can be solved. I wish that in 1945 we'd gotten this great idea, this country, to charge $15 a year rental for everybody's TV set, and then use that money to build a wonderful, well-financed broadcast network like some friends of ours across the ocean who also speak English. But we didn't. And there's one lobby in Washington which is more powerful than Charlton Heston and the rifle lobby, and that's the broadcast lobby. They are the most powerful of all, and they're not going to change anything. So what we have is what we've got, and I do see, as I think many people on the panel see, vast changes in the way that, for example, broadcast information is presented. I think the three network newscasts are anachronisms. I think CBS will probably be sold to CNN before too long, which would be deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra would say. This almost happened 20 years ago. I guess my guess would be that the CBS Evening News would be the first of the broadcasts to be eliminated in a few years. But I think they're all going to go. They're all anachronisms, and we're going to get our news in a different way. Maybe we're all going to have one TV screen that has the computer and the HBO and the news such as it is all in the living room. I don't know, but I suggest anybody who does want to predict for you what it is going to look like is a fool or a charlatan. But it is going to change. The other thing I don't think is going to change is the problems that we have. I don't see any reason, barring some kind of revolution or all of us getting up and shooting the network bosses, of getting any more foreign news or curing any of the problems that we've been talking about. Kaboom.
Listen, we have 15 short minutes, and I think we'd like to throw it open to questions from you all. There are two microphones.
This is the end of side one. Please turn over your tape and continue listening on side two.
I was going to ask a question before the panel about, especially from Judy and Richard on our right, about local news, and does that have an influence on what happens when you get into network news? And because having worked in the business but having left 20 years ago, I am just curious now, having heard what you said, that even if, because of the ownership, corporate ownership, that even if all the news people involved were the ones who cared, were the ones who agreed with what we, I'm saying generally, would like to believe, that I'm not sure you think that anything could be done, because just as Nixon had to keep going through people before they would fire Cox and this kind of thing, is it that there's no hope with the situation the way it is, that even if the journalists themselves want to do the good job, that they can't keep their jobs because of the corporate ownership, because of the profit motive, and because of that. Have we reached that point?
In broadcasting, yes, there was a terrific panel a couple of hours ago on media mergers, and the point was made that most broadcast news information now belongs to 2 or 3 just huge mega, AOL, Time Warner, Disney, and journalism, A, accounts for virtually nothing or very little in the way of profits for these multi-zillion-dollar corporations, and B, journalism is not even on the radar of the guys who run them. So, to me, there's no hope. The only way these guys are going to use journalism is to use it as synergy for their corporation, to make, forgive me, NBC News the hood ornament on this huge thing called General Electric. Well, if I work for NBC News or CBS with Viacom or ABC with the mouse, I'm going to get nervous.
Yes.
I'm a reporter from the Daily Bruin. I do intend on majoring in communication and hope someday to be a journalist. And what I want to know is you paint such a grim picture of, journalism today. And, you're saying it's all features. Yes, I am a feature writer, and I do agree that some of the stuff is in there is really news light and fluff. What is it going to take for people...
You're going to have to speak just a little slower.
I'm sorry.
Some of us are having trouble.
Okay, basically, yes, I do agree with you that most of the stuff that is in, the feature section is news fluff. But, I know us here at the Daily Bruin, we do try to bring relevant news and information to students. But what I want to know is, what is it going to be, what are we going to have to do as future journalists to bring back, relevant news? What is it going to take for us to step up to that challenge and, what are we going to have to face to make news, important again?
You're going to have to ask yourself why you want to be a journalist. That would be my question to you. Because I don't think, now I'm going to go way over to the other side, I don't think it's such a grim picture necessarily if you want a job. If you can get a job, these aren't bad jobs as they go. There's more insecurity now than there's ever been, but that's true in all employment categories. So if your desire is to get a good job somewhere and you're educated well enough and you can comply well enough with the atmosphere in which you are submerged, then you'll do okay. But is that why you want to be a journalist? Do you want to, now we're going to get really hokey. Do you want to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable? If that's what you want to do, which is what you're supposed to do, then it's not going to be easy. Because if you're out afflicting the comfortable usually don't get very pleased by that. So my answer to you is that you have an enormous responsibility if you are really going to be a journalist, because you're going to have to fight very hard by yourself and with other fellow journalists, if you can get their attention, in order to open those margins and to open those spaces that you need in order to do good work. It's not going to be easy, and it would be, I think it would be irresponsible to say, oh, you'll be fine, because you won't. You'll have to fight for it.
But there are more ways to fight than just getting a job on NBC or ABC. The fact is that the people do now have control of many of the means of production. People are self-publishing books. They're doing stories which are then picked up and selling because it's easy, because there is the system is much more democratic with a small d than it used to be in terms of how you could deliver information. There are simply more outlets, and if the information is good enough, it's going to be paid attention to.
Right here.
One of the things that you've discussed, the problems like in the corporate boardroom and the editors and correspondents who work for news media, but you haven't, in a sense, discussed the problem of the audience out there in a way. And it reminds me of the story of some high school or college English teacher who, as she was reading term papers, could easily tell, for example, who was really print educated versus who was media educated, really, in this. And of course, you're looking at an audience, not this particular audience for sure, which is probably all print educated. But you're looking, at the grand audience outside that is unfortunately all media educated today. I don't know if the internet in any way is going to change this. Maybe there could be some comment about that.
No, the problem is, the problem isn't just quickly, 30 seconds. The problem isn't always just the audience. Sometimes it's the newscasters. At CNN, while I was working out the other morning, In 5 minutes, the newscaster said the word realtor, nuclear, and Smithsonian Institute. It was a hat trick in 5 minutes. You know, that's a national newscast. Sorry.
Well, I think this gets back to what I was talking about in terms of media literacy. You can't change the fact, you aren't going to get the future generations to just read newspapers and ignore the television set. That's over. But I think we can educate kids better to be more discriminating viewers and understand what the sources are behind a story, how credible is this report versus that one. And we aren't teaching that because there's this feeling in the schools still that anything having to do with television or I think is somehow a softball course or something. But it's how they're getting their information, and I think we really have to address it.
Yes.
Well, I think we can't stop the technology. I was thinking in terms of, you know, all of these things were said when the printing press, when the first rolling rotary printing press were involved, same thing was said about the telephone. The fact is, yes, people over a certain age are print-oriented and whatnot. My wife runs the UN office in Washington, and she was hiring a third-level press person, and the way she did that, this is within the last 2 weeks, the way she did that was advertising in Roll Call, which is a newspaper put out in Washington for and about the Congress. And she got 35, if I remember it correctly, 35 applications, mostly from congressional staffs, mostly from well-educated, obviously, people. Not one of those people had touched Roll Call. All 35 of them had gotten that from posted job notices from Roll Call on the internet. That's the way it is, and there's no decision any of us or anybody out there can make that's going to change the fact that other generations will seize new technologies. The medium is the message, just as we did in our time.
Yeah, my question is, I mean, to be blunt, who the hell are these focus groups that keep telling us we need to see this junk the way it is? You know, most people I know who read news at all or have any interest are reasonably educated. So if that's your demographic to begin with, the people who'd even turn on, why are we constantly being told that, no, this is what sells, this gets us ratings, especially as you talk about the fact that ratings are declining anyway? Isn't there an audience for intelligent debate? I personally, and I can name a lot of other people, have given up on the network news. I don't turn it on. I can't stand it. I've given up on the U.S. news magazines for the same reason, frankly, I've given up on the LA Times in a lot of cases. And it's not out of desire. It's that it's just I'm being told junk. And why isn't there a market for this? The Economist does very well writing, whether you agree with their slant on stuff or not, writing about international news. The BBC is still incredibly respected overseas. Why in this country are we stuck on this idea that intelligent news does not sell? Because I'm not sure I buy it.
What are you reading? I mean, you've given everything up. What were you?
The Economist is a lot.
That's okay.
And NPR is my radio savior. And honestly, I never get home in time to watch Jim Lehrer anymore.
Well, it's interesting to note that there's two CNNs. There's the Dumb and Dumber version, which we get in this country, and then there's the CNN International, which actually is not bad.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And why don't we get it here?
Well, you want to know about focus? I think focus groups are bad science.
But
I don't know who they're talking to. I think they often ask questions as in, did you like that? You know, you want more of that? And I think that it's also, I know that the audience that they want is the 18 to something or others, because the 18 to something or others apparently are still picking brands. This is what I was told. Why isn't there more information for people my age? Is it because you've chosen Crest and you're sticking with it? I mean, this is the rationale we're talking about here. And this is how they make decisions. Somebody makes decisions, I don't know. But I agree with you. I think it's a bad idea. I think they ought to get rid of it, and I think we ought to get back to sitting around having editorial discussions about what do people need to know to be well informed. They don't know to say because they haven't been told. How can you need to know something that you don't know about? Thank you.
But, you know, Judy, without having any inside information about who are in these focus groups, I would suggest that the focus groups aren't just about the news content. Remember that we're talking about a whole media environment. So the focus groups run by CBS aren't just to find out what you want to hear on CBS News. They're how to keep you watching CBS. The news, whatever on the news, is a very small part of that. So the real idea is how to keep you there through the dinner hour to make sure you're there when Survivor comes on, for which there is a market of millions and millions and tens of millions of people. The danger is, I think we all agree on this panel, at no point in American history did the American people get together and call up the networks and say, this is the crap we want, please put it on. But the danger is that you create a taste. Americans, I don't think, intrinsically are any dumber than the Brits. You listen to a BBC newscast today with the same sort of commercial pressures that exist in Great Britain that exist here. You listen to the BBC newscast, which I happened to hear last night by accident at 12:30 in the middle of the night on a public radio station. It sounds like it's coming from Jupiter. I mean, because the lead stories are about the entire world, right, and taken very, very seriously. Right?
Well, we don't have, I mean, but part of the problem is not in the stars, but in ourselves. The fact is that England is now a relatively small island country, and as any country surrounded by other people and other languages has to know more about how the world is acting. Whether it was imposed on us or in some way we all agree, the feeling, certainly from the top, from the White House to, I'm sure, many people right here feel, America has no need to know about these things. We are the 800-pound gorilla. We can do what we want, where we want, and when we want, and what the hell do we care what they think of it in the Netherlands?
And we should note that the BBC is having severe financial problems now, too, and may not continue to exist in the form that we've come to know.
But there is an American mindset that has a great deal to do with the kind of news that's being produced.
There was a Cold
today.
War. We won. It's over, and we can just go our merry way.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have time for, I'm sorry to say, one more question right here.
The implication that there might be other models has floated around the panel. The BBC was just referred to, that might be one. Then we just heard that the BBC might be folding. But what are those other models to people up there at J schools, and are the J schools thinking about those other models, and how do we reach those other models? Might have something to do with what's been going on in licensing of the airwaves, things like that.
How about a 1% tax on all advertising in the United States of America? Or a 1% tax on all television advertising, creating a fund of $8 or $10 billion a year to create real public broadcasting instead of the anemic couple $100 million that the Congress, when it feels like it, throws towards PBS.
How about bringing back the public interest requirement and the fairness doctrine, both of which were removed under the Reagan administration?
Or how about, deriving some revenue from selling the public airwaves?
Yeah, how about that? $70 billion worth.
Judy, do you have a closing bon mot for this group?
Let's put on the show. No.
I would say we are putting on a show, but if you go to that kind of system, who decides what is to be broadcast?
You know, Richard, at the risk of saying that we're run out of time here and the time for a commercial break, that's an interesting question, but it's probably another topic, and I know many of you have other rendezvous with destiny, so we better stop here. Thank you for coming.
This is the end of Side 2 and concludes the presentation.